Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got another unscripted movie review, this time of Solo, a Star Wars story. Okay, y'all see this? This is my copy of the Star Wars story, The Han Solo Adventures. This was part of the original expanded universe. It's a set of 3 novellas kind of bucketed together. It's not great, but I've read it a bunch of times. I mostly like it. Of the expanded universe, it's one of the parts that actually holds up halfway decently, along with the Thrawn trilogy and some of the X-Wing books. And I only bring this up because, in terms of telling a prequel story, there are some expectations surrounding the characters that will eventually arrive at a certain spot. We know that who Han Solo is because of A New Hope, and we know in order to tell his backstory, stories like these help flesh out the character. And really, I wouldn't say they drive huge character development, because they don't, but in order to satisfy the drive and hunger for more Star Wars coming out of the 90s, books like this were all that we had. And yes, I am fully aware that this whole thing was wiped out of continuity and was being replaced with a movie like the Han Solo adventure that we got with this. Funny thing, I don't think anybody besides marketing executives really cared about this. See, who the hell wants a Han Solo movie? I know you're making a movie for the sake of making a movie. Isn't that the purpose behind any artistic endeavor? I totally get that. But Han Solo is, at least in my opinion, probably one of the least interesting parts of that element of the Star Wars legacy. He's an interesting character, don't get me wrong, but if you're trying to tell all those famous stories that come out behind the Kessel Run, how he meets Chewie, a lot of the elements of his backstory, well, the expanded universe already did that for one, so immediately in the minds of a die-hard Star Wars fan like myself, you're gonna end up making comparisons. And for another, well, I only have to call back to the prequel trilogy and how they showed the Clone Wars, or what we saw in some of the TV shows telling about the Clone Wars. And you immediately have your ideas of what they could be in your mind, and then the prequels go in to fill in the gaps, and they will almost inevitably never be as good as you're hoping they are. And even with that, a lot of the expectations going into the Han Solo movie were not good. Like, I wasn't totally crazy about Alden Ehrenreich being able to step into this role. I mean, you're trying to act as if you're Harrison Ford, man. Like, that's probably a near impossible task, but hey, you had Donald Glover stepping in Lando, and that's pretty damn inspired. And you had Woody Harrelson, you had Paul Bettany, you had some ringers here to make this a good movie. And indeed, this is a good movie. There are problems with it, and oh my god, there will be spoilers in this because we have to talk about some certain things tied into that continuity. And yes, continuity does come up here, but overall it's a good movie, but it's also a movie that feels the least necessary out of the entire Star Wars expansion that's come after the prequels in terms of these new sequel movies. It's not as good as Rogue One. It's not as good as The Last Jedi, but then again, I really like The Last Jedi. I would say it's a shade bit better than The Force Awakens for me, because that movie really was a fan film when it came to what it was trying to do in terms of telling a Star Wars story from J.J. Abrams' perspective. But this movie, if there is a movie that, if anything, emulates the most elements of the fan film structure in terms of filling in the gaps, it really is Solo, a Star Wars story, in terms of showing the classic Sabacc game, showing how Han Solo left Corellia and go over to Caridia, even though we don't see Caridia, which is, I think this is a total waste. You should have done something with the Academy. But again, you're not criticizing the movie Mark you wanted, you're criticizing the movie you got. And overall, I will give this movie points for several things. Alden Ehrenreich, for as much as what he has to do, he does a fine enough job playing a much younger Han Solo. And I like whenever Chewbacca's in this movie. I like Chewie as a whole. Lando, when you have Donald Glover playing him, that's inspired casting. Woody Harrelson is great in terms of his old sort of grizzled smuggler character. And Paul Bettany as the sort of ruthless crime boss. I enjoyed his role there. And I really did appreciate, considering that Ron Howard was expecting to step in and fill in a lot of the elements of direction from Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, he does a fine job. There's a lot more grime to this movie. It is a dirty movie. It allows you to really sink into that Star Wars atmosphere in a way that, well, you haven't really seen since Rogue One, and I appreciated that. I appreciate that this is what the universe looks like under the Empire on even a planet like Corellia, which is a core system. Okay, marginally core, but that's me getting Star Wars nerdy again. And overall, I like the the fact that they decided, like, okay, this is going to be a lower stakes movie. We're going to make it a Star Wars Western. And really, the fact that they pull on so many iconic Western tropes and really flesh out how much Han Solo was getting by the seat of his pants, I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the levels of hustle that comes into certain scenes. And you know what? As much as we're going to see that famed Kessel Run, it's about as good as it was ever going to get, folks. I honestly will say that. It was one of those moments you didn't need to see on screen, but when it happens in the second act, it is genuinely awesome. And frankly, if I'm going to see the movie for anything, it's going to be that sequence because it was really well done. Unfortunately, the movie needs to go on after that sequence. And this is where I have issues with this film, because when it plays as a morally ambiguous Star Wars Western and plays into a lot of the tropes of that subgenre, you realize that by the time it has to start becoming a regular conventional bad guys versus good guys Star Wars narrative, while still playing somewhat into some of the Western tropes, by the time you get to the third act, it's not there. It feels like I'm sitting there waiting for a larger part of the movie or a larger climax that just does not happen. And I'm not going to say that the acting is bad. I'm not going to say that Paul Bettany doesn't sell what he has to do there, or what Woody Harrelson sells what he has to do there, because there is tension that's executed in these scenes. There's as much tension as you can get with a prequel. And I didn't mind some of the Easter eggs that were getting called out. Again, this is immersing me in Star Wars arcana. I really did enjoy watching the Sabacc games between Lando and Han. This is something that I've imagined on screen countless times before, and I've read in the expanded universe, and I appreciate that. The problem that comes beyond the much lower seeming stakes that come out of the third act is that it starts pushing Han towards the fact that he is going to be more of a conventional hero in the future, a lot of telegraphing there, and it wasn't needed. Let him play into the classical roguish archetype, even though he does have that darker moment at the end, which you kind of need to see coming as much as he grows into his arc. But at the same time, there could have been more there. There just could have been a little bit more to flesh out the stakes and the tension of that final scene, instead of implying that, yes, you're going to wind up joining the rebellion. We all know that. We've seen the movies. And this is where the Solo movie runs into issues. And I'm going to put up a massive, massive spoiler warning here. If you want to go see the movie, go see it. Although from what I'm seeing of the box office numbers, a lot of people are not seeing this movie. It's still worth your time, even if it is kind of inessential. It's a fun romp. But again, spoiler warning is going up now. If you don't want me to spoil any parts of this movie, and I'm going to, get out now. Okay, so this is where we're going to have to talk about continuity. And the element that comes in with continuity, and this is something that Star Wars has been doing with this expanded universe a fair bit. Because just to give you guys a little bit of context, what's actually in continuity right now, you have all of the movies, those are in continuity, fine, and you have the cartoons, and inevitably the cartoons have drawn upon some elements of the EU, because like it or not, there were elements of the EU that we want to keep on and we want to keep in continuity. So when you see Thrawn get brought back for the Rebels trilogy, fine. And much as like there's other elements in terms of Mandalorian surrounding that, better than what Karen Traviss was doing with them, so I'm okay with that. The thing is that Solo, in some elements, it was going to inevitably have to lean on some elements of continuity. It's going to reference Kessel. It's going to reference the moss surrounding Kessel. And yeah, that was kind of awesome. I appreciated that. That was a great sequence. But then you start hearing reference points, and especially if you're a Star Wars nerd like myself, like, you're going to recognize Corellia, sure. But then he says the Imperial Academy is on Caridia. Okay, easy bone for the fans. I know that the Imperial Academy was on Caridia. You don't see any of the Imperial Academy on Caridia, but fine, I don't care about that. Then you get scenes with Lando, and Lando references a fact when he was gambling, and the fact that he won an entire moon. Now, I actually went and go to check some of my Star Wars source books. That didn't actually happen, so I'm like, okay, fine. And then I remember that Lando didn't win a moon, but Han won a planet once in a high-stakes game. I think it was about 4 years after the Battle of Endor, in a book called The Courtship of Princess Leia. And this wouldn't bother me. Again, you take what you need from continuity and you just keep moving. And then you get a scene near the end with the main female love interest, Kira, played by Emilia Clarke, and for as much as her character is kind of a stand-in and saying that I will be important in later movies and later continuity, I didn't mind that. She was generally acting pretty well in the situation, in the rather thankless role that she had. But then she gets a scene where she shows her true allegiance. And there's two things that happen. The first thing, guess who's back in continuity, and guess who survived the end of episode 1. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to spoil anything, but if you've seen the cartoons, you kind of know this, and I was okay with that. I'm like, okay, so he's now taking a role in the movies now. That was fine. Some of that happened out of Rogue One as well. There were characters that came off the cartoons and then later showed up in Rogue One. Fine. I'm traveling with that. I've accepted the continuity as it is. Then they referenced the rendezvous planet of Dathomir. Now, I know what Dathomir is, because I read The Courtship of Princess Leia. And that was the planet that Han Solo won in a high-stakes gambling game. I'm not sure if it was Sabacc. It might have been, might have not have been. Can't remember off the top of my head. But the fact is that you're referencing fragments of associated continuity for a pick-and-choose, pile-on moment in order to partially draw resonance, because non-accepting fans, they won't care. They won't know who Dathomir is. They'll recognize that ending cameo plenty, and honestly, I don't mind that, especially if they're going to build off that later. That could be pretty cool. But at the same time, if you're referencing fragments of continuity that the die-hard Star Wars fans do know, well, it's like walking out of War for the Planet of the Apes, which that was the place where my mind went, is that I'm seeing tropes that I've already seen referenced in the original Planet of the Apes movie. Is trying to get the pop from the audience to say, hey, you got this, you referenced it, we're gonna take this and do weird things with it. The problem is with the Han Solo stuff is that if you're going to make such a loose use of the continuity to try to get the pop, you're gonna draw reference to the fans who know the story and will know when you're doing it wrong. And the infuriating thing is that when you're telling a prequel story, especially one where we have seen the pieces come together before in different forms, it immediately draws the mind's natural comparison point to those stories. And it makes you look at Solo and I'm like, yeah, this is a good Han Solo story, but is it better than what we could have seen in the story of Caridia, where, and coming after the Academy, where Han actually did graduate and not get thrown out? Or does it call back to the story of Yylessia, or anything with Thrak and Sal Solo, or any of the original stories surrounding Nar Shaddaa, and anything that actually had where Han and Lando properly met beyond this movie? I get retracing and rebuilding a continuity that comes out by the fact that you're making a movie. Fine. But if you're drawing reference to that past continuity by making reference of it in the movies, specifically so you can get a pop from the fans, you can't get angry when the fans are like, oh, hang on, we know what you're doing. We've seen you do this before. There's gaps here. Might not be as good. Now, thankfully, it is still good. And the other thing you have to realize is that the Star Wars EU was never all that it was cracked up to be, even as a die-hard fan. I can accept that. There's a lot of bad comics and bad novels associated with the Star Wars EU, and if this movie's gonna pave over a bunch of them, fine. But it was distracting. It pulls you out of a movie like this. And really, when you have a movie with such small stakes, especially coming into your third act, especially when the third act conflict does not really build off of the second act and the emotional catharsis feels really crowbarred into trying to force Han towards a point that he would already get by the end of The New Hope, it just gets distracting, and it doesn't help for the internal consistency of the film. I still think it's good, don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed this movie, but I'm only giving it a light 7 out of 10. I will only say it's slightly better than A Force Awakens, which again, that was a fan film, but again, this movie frustrated me because of all the people who would be such an easy mark for this movie, the fact that you have to keep on crowbarring in references when you don't need to, and the fact that those references immediately spark comparisons to where this origin was told in a different way and maybe even told better in some cases, I don't know. It's the only thing that would come with somebody who is a diehard fan like myself, and I freely admit that if you're not going in with that level of baggage, you'll probably have a lot of fun with this movie if you bother to go see it at all, and you can get past some of the casting issues. I think Alden Ehrenreich is as fine as you can get for a Han Solo character. I don't know what anyone could have done to match Harrison Ford. Again, I can only recommend it for fans of Star Wars. I think you're gonna have a good time with it. It's a good Western-style story, and it can be pretty funny at certain points, although I gotta be honest, there are parts of me that kind of wishes it had leaned into that slightly more comedic tone a little bit more. Probably would have saved it from that heel turn in the third act, which really feels like studio mandate. But beyond that, hey, it's fun. I can't get that angry at it. I'm a Star Wars mark at the end of the day. I appreciate the chemistry. All the actors play off each other really well. I don't know where the hell you take this story. And then there's a part of me that really does not want to see this story taken anywhere else. The Lando stuff, that could be really cool, sure. But Boba Fett, you don't need to do that. You're already referencing Bosk in this movie. Yes, I caught that one too, but it's not something you need to do. I'd say if you're going to do more of these spin-offs, take it in an interesting direction. Tell the Leia story, honestly. I've seen that being talked about on Twitter. Tell the Leia story of her doing court on stuff like Alderaan or Coruscant, or even maybe sketch out stuff like the Gorman Massacre or stuff this had in Arianu with Grand Moff Tarkin where she had previously met him before. Like, play off of that history, make it a court intrigue story, do something in that direction. You don't need to tell stories about Boba Fett or even Lando, as much as I would enjoy the Lando story. Again, I'm going to be stuck comparing it to stuff that you're already drawing reference to. And really with Leia stuff, as much as it would be the same sort of thing, I would probably end up enjoying it more, if only because I think there's a little more unexplored meat to those bones. But anyway, if you guys want to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And I know I'm probably going to be harder on this than some people will. It is kind of an inessential movie, but it's fun. Probably worth seeing. So until next time, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. May the Force be with you. Always.